Hey everybody, welcome back to All Fiction is Fantasy. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, today is something a little different, at least the first half of this video, and that is going to be a vlog entry about my reading habits with a little touch on some topics such as book collecting versus reading. And then after we go through that, we will go into a new book haul video because I have picked up some very interesting things over the last month or so. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my reading habits and my reading history. My parents had a small library growing up, and I was intensely interested in books at a very young age. I remember seeing things like Dune, Out of the Silent Planet, the Tripods trilogy, Dragon World, and Foundation on my mom's bookshelves. They fascinated me. My mom was really into science fiction and some fantasy, and she read The Hobbit to me at a young age, and that was kind of a formative experience for me. I remember vividly just kind of sitting on the floor in front of my parents' bookshelves and just looking at books, touching them, and feeling the weight of the paper in my hands. At elementary school, book fair days were always the absolute best days of the year. And I would actually buy books for other kids if they couldn't get them because I wanted other people to have books. Even though I was interested in books and reading, I didn't really love getting books from libraries. I always preferred to own the books I was reading. I would go to libraries as a kind of way to browse things that were available. I was an avid reader throughout my entire life. I discovered Stephen King in 7th grade. Before that, I read a lot of choose your own adventures and game books like Lone Wolf and Fighting Fantasy. Later, I would discover grocery store spinner rack horror. And a few years later after that, Westerns at my grandpa's house. And then I got really into vintage science fiction and fantasy. In high school, I got into subversive writers like Robert Anton Wilson, and then on to Philip K. Dick and Michael Moorcock. For a few years, I got really into theology and spirituality. I read a lot of books from Thomas Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh, and Christian apologetics written by C.S. Lewis and Alistair McGrath. For a few years, I was a bookstore manager at Tower Records. And really, this was during the last kind of few years that Tower Records was cool before they sold out to a bunch of ex-Best Buy CEOs and destroyed the brand. And probably rightly so. They were trying to run a good business. And we kind of viewed our shelves, our sections at Tower Records as part of our personal collection. And we would just hope that people would be into what we were into. But one of my favorite things to do at Tower Records as the book sale manager was order books. I would get these just amazing book catalogs from underground distributors like Last Gasp in San Francisco. And I would spend hours talking to them about all these cool books that I would order and would unfortunately just kind of sit on the shelf because people in my hometown weren't really interested in a lot of the books that we were carrying. Now I basically read a little bit of everything with a focus on mass market paperback genre fiction up through about the mid-1990s. I read very little contemporary fiction outside of horror. I think modern contemporary horror just keeps getting better and better every year. There is so much good going on in that. I read very little modern contemporary science fiction and fantasy. What I have read just doesn't speak to me. And most importantly, I hate modern book covers. And book covers are super important to me. So that is why I mainly read and collect vintage mass market paperbacks. The peak of my reading volume was between 2010 and 2012. During those years, I was reading about 60 to 80 books a year. This coincided with a few things. These were the discovery of Goodreads. I had a project where I was reading most of the Hugo and Nebula award winners up to a certain point, up to a certain year to expand my horizons, to expand my stable of authors. and also discovering the new weird with authors like Jeff Vandermeer, Michael Sisko, and Thomas Ligotti. On January 10th, 2016, David Bowie died, and then the world turned to utter shit for a long time. And I kind of had my attention completely stolen for about 4 years because I was absolutely I was obsessed with the ongoings of the world and the situations happening. And I just couldn't bring myself to stop doom scrolling. I became a doom scrolling junkie. I would stay up all night worrying about shit completely out of my control. And I just lost the ability to focus on prose fiction. So that is to say, from about 2016 to 2020, I really didn't read much prose fiction at all. I just couldn't concentrate. During these years, I got my fiction fix from dungeon crawl and adventure board games and RPGs. And those were the years that I decided to turn that into to turn that hobby into a YouTube channel, and that is the Dungeon Dive. But during these years, I also got back into reading comic books, and that was a great rediscovery for me. And I discovered that I really loved reading digital comic books, especially the guided view reading on Kindle. I love that. On paper, I reread things like Akira and some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I got into Scud and a few other things. And then I read a bunch of newer Batman and Superman books, the Dark Horse Alien stuff, some Cthulhu comics, and a whole bunch of other things. I have a couple who are married and they're friends, probably like my best friends, and they read so many comic books. And so I always turn to them for good comic book recommendations. And I loved rediscovering my love for comic books and discovering my love for digital comic books during that time. Since about 2021, I've been making a concerted effort to rip my time and attention back from the ongoings of world events. I've started reading a lot of fiction again, not as much as I was reading in 2010 to 2012, but I'm working on getting back to that level. I now read about 3 to 4 books per month. I would like to get that up to 5 on average. However, during those years in my reading desert, I never stopped buying books. I've always loved buying books. Even when I was young, I recognized the power and importance of having my own library. Yes, even an unread library. It was super empowering to discover Umberto Eco's essay about the power of the unread library, and that power lies in its potential. I like owning books because I just love them as things. I love cover art. Cover art is super important to me. I have discovered so many great books because of their covers. I judge books on their covers all the time. That is why I mainly only buy vintage paperbacks. Book collecting and book reading are two separate, sometimes complementary hobbies. Some of the people I know who read the most don't even own books. They are just book readers, and that's awesome. I love that they can do that. They just load things up on their Kindle and read. My wife is like that. Her best friend is also like that, and she reads probably more books than anybody I know. I know some people that own a ton of books who really don't spend much meaningful time reading at all. They are only book collectors and book resellers. I'm somewhere in the middle. Although I am not interested in buying to sell. I am not an investor or a seller. I'm a collector and a reader. I love going to bookstores to hunt for cool things I've never seen. Some of my most cherished early memories are of bookstores. I remember the first time I ever saw The Gunslinger on the shelf, and I was absolutely baffled and confused by Stephen King writing westerns. What? This guy writes It and Pet Sematary. What's this weird western he wrote? And I remember the stores that I first saw things like Death Dealer and Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the Horse Clan books, Redwall, Lone Wolf, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And I vividly remember a time at a mall when I discovered the Chronicles of Narnia Choose Your Own Adventure books. My high school science fiction and fantasy class took a trip to a bookstore, and that's when I discovered Elric. You know, these are super important core memories to me. And there are a lot of books that I remember the act of buying more than I do the act of reading. So yes, I love buying books just as much as I love reading books. And speaking of that, let's get down to the table now and look at some new things that I've purchased. Okay, let's take a look at some of the stuff I've purchased over the last month and a half or so. I've gotten some really interesting things. Let's start over here on the right. And this is an Arkham House book by Basil Copper, and this is Necropolis, a novel of Gothic mystery. This is an Arkham House book that you can still find for a pretty decent price. I think I got this for about under $20, and it is in very, very nice condition. I have only read a handful of stories from Basil Copper. I do have a couple collections of his. A buddy of mine recommended this to me. I loved that cover by Stephen E. Fabian. So really nice edition. This is the second printing, but I think it looks really nice and I'm glad to own this. I want to read more Basil Copper. And then a couple new things. After I just got done mentioning that I don't read a lot of new things, we are going to take a look at a bunch of new fiction here, or newer, I should say. The first few we'll take a look at are a little funny because they are related to the Arkham Horror board game. So as you guys know, I'm working on a series now where I am going through a lot of the fiction, the story about the Cthulhu mythos that inspired the Arkham Horror series of board games, because I think those games themselves do a pretty poor job of telling players the history of the mythos and what it all means. But what's cool is the board game, even though it was inspired by a bunch of other writers, the game itself has now inspired its own fiction, and I've been really interested in checking some of it out. So I purchased 2 novella collections. I love novellas. And this is Dark Origins, the Collected Novellas Volume 1, and Grim Investigation, the Collected Novellas Volume 2. So these have modern mythos novellas written by Dave Gross, Graham Davis, Richard Lee Byers, Chris A. Jackson, Jennifer Brozak, Richard Lee Byers, Amanda Downham, and more. And I'm really interested in reading these because I don't know too much about these authors. I'm interested to see how really modern mythos fiction is written. And even more related to the board game here is the Investigators of Arkham Horror, Tales of Adventure and Madness. This awesome book here contains a short story involving every single, or at least most of, it looks like most, probably every single investigator in the game. So we have stories about like Harvey Walters and Min Tai Fan and Silas Marsh and Jenny Barnes and all of the people that we love playing, Joe Diamond, Diana Stanley, Rita Young, Amanda Sharp. So all of the investigators from the book or from the game have a little short story in this huge, awesome kind of coffee table size book. And that is absolutely overflowing with great art from the games and great art from the huge collection of art that Fantasy Flight Games has created for their Arkham Files game series. And this book just seems super cool. I hope that some of the stories are well written. If at least half of them are, I will be pretty happy. But I think it's neat to read a little bit about these characters in here. I mean, that is just fantastic. You know, the games do a good job of creating emergent narratives, and I think the background of the different investigators in the games are interesting. And I'm very curious about reading these stories and seeing how they transpire and what kind of what things they touch upon and how they handle some of the mythos, how they handle maybe some of its problematic elements, and how they modernize some things and how they keep things interesting. Are they scary? Are they spooky? Are they interesting? Do they further develop the investigators? Will these stories make my games of Arkham Horror more interesting? Those are all things that I don't know. Those are all things that I'm hoping. So really, really curious about reading this new modern Arkham Horror inspired fiction. I love how those games were inspired by fiction, and now those games are inspiring their own works of fiction. I think that is super cool. And speaking of modern mythos stuff, I also just picked up this Bond Unknown book. And this contains 2 stories, one written by Edward M. Erdelak and one by William Michael. Edward M. Erdelak, the author of one of my favorite series of all time, and that is The Merkaba Rider. The Merkaba Rider is a weird Western that mixes Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah folklore with the Cthulhu mythos. And this is 2 novellas about Bond, James Bond fighting the Cthulhu mythos. So this says, this is occult section Bond. 00 fights in the shadows. O branch fights the shadows themselves. The occult branch. I love that. James Bond fights for Queen, country, and sanity in 2 new adventures from a pair of master storytellers. Each novella pitches Bond in a world where H.P. Lovecraft's mythos exists. It's not his mythos. Exists alongside other supernatural threats. I know people are going to be tired of me saying that. I'll stop saying that soon. The story's told with affection and reverence for the original novels. I am more interested in Erdelak, so let's read the synopsis of that. In Mindbreaker by Edward M. Erdelak, James Bond is recruited into a little-known section of M16, the O branch, to investigate the disappearance of a member of the royal family. Naturally skeptical of any supernatural connotations, Bond finds himself forced into a mission that stretches his very insanity to breaking point. As he travels to Egypt and Corsica in pursuit of the nefarious masterminds behind the kidnapping. Along the way, he encounters a beautiful archaeologist who is into much more than dusty trinkets, a vast, indestructible, brute, and violent worshippers of dark magics, older than recorded time. If Bond is to succeed, he cannot rely on his wits and gun alone. This time, he must first open his mind to unreasonable possibilities. Very cool. Super curious about this one. And then also speaking of Edward M. Erdelak, if you are interested in Erdelak, this is a great place to start because this book, for some reason, it's not even on sale. Just the normal price is $5 on Amazon. I have no idea why, but this is The Sword and Pistol, a collection by Edward M. Erdelak. And this includes Red Sails, a horror-themed pirate adventure. It includes Night of the Jikaninki, and Sinbad, and the Sword of Solomon, and Gully Gods. So this sounds like it's Erdelak working in maybe sword and sorcery mode, or at least a nautical themed fantasy mode. And then if any of you watch my board game channel, I recently did a review that was my longest review so far, and that was over an hour, and that was for a game that nobody really cares about, a game from 2015 called Albion's Legacy. And that is a game based on the Arthurian legends. And I know next to nothing about the Arthurian legends. And so the board game inspired me to read about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And in doing some research, I discovered this newer book by John Matthews with illustrations by John Howe and a foreword by Neil Gaiman. And I've read about this book, and this seems to be kind of the modern, the definitive modern book of King Arthur. John Matthews is like a premier Arthurian scholar, and he's taken all of the works about King Arthur, the official works, kind of rewritten them and transcribed them and translated them and compiled them and put everything together in this absolutely beautiful book. And I am really excited to read this. So here's the arms of Thomas Malory there. So Thomas Malory, of course, the original author of The Death of King Arthur, on which a large portion of this book is based. But we have the Book of Merlin, the Book of the Round Table. We have the Book of Sir Gawain, the Book of the Grail, and the Ending of the Round Table. And just a really nice foreword by Neil Gaiman, but all kinds of wonderful art from John Howe. I love his art so much, and I like the layout of this book. The column pages will make this super easy to read. The art will make it entertaining, and I just can't wait to read more about King Arthur because I absolutely fell in love with that game, Albion's Legacy. I'm constantly thinking about it, and I've been really interested in learning more about King Arthur. Okay, now we'll go into this middle stack here. And first up are two books that I've owned before, but I own these in a really big kind of trade paperback omnibus edition. And I've been wanting to find these individually. And I found them at a really great price at a local bookstore called Page Turner Books, one of the best genre bookstores in Seattle. It's in Kent. It's in the Seattle area, in the city of Kent, and it is an amazing bookstore. If you live here, go to Page Turner Books, but they have a great online selection, and so I ordered these from their online store. And those are Richard Paul Russo. I believe Richard Paul Russo is actually from Seattle, and he's a great author, super underrated. His book, Ship of Fools, is excellent, kind of a theological science fiction, and his trilogy on Carlucci is one of my favorite works of cyberpunk, especially these two, Carlucci's Edge and Carlucci's Heart. So really happy to find these in this great edition. Let's see. Destroying Angel is the first one. I still need to find that in a mass market size. But in Destroying Angel, award-winning author Richard Paul Russo created a new breed of cop novel, mixing high-tech serial murder with raw human emotion. Now his latest masterwork of science fiction and suspense marks the explosive return of Lieutenant Frank Carlucci, a cop on the edge of tomorrow, a hardwired world of crime and corruption, a world that has captured unanimous literary acclaim. And here we have from Carlucci's Heart. And the burned out streets of 21st century San Francisco, Lieutenant Frank Carlucci is drawn into an investigation surrounding the disappearance of his daughter's friend, a dying man who was carried off mysteriously. It's one kidnapping nobody seems to want to talk about, but as Carlucci digs deeper, the corruption and decay he finds is nothing compared to a final horror that could have devastating implications, a secret known only as Cancer Cell. When were these written? I believe early 90s, I want to say. Let's see. Originally published in 1995, that one there. And this was probably 97. Yeah, 97. So if you've never read Richard Paul Russo, I highly recommend him. If you've never read their Carlucci trilogy, I highly recommend that. Another book I ordered from Page Turner is David Morrell's The Totem. So David Morrell, probably most famous for First Blood, for creating Rambo. But he has written some amazing horror fiction. One of his horror short stories is one of my favorite short stories of all time. And I always get the title confused, so I'll just print it here. A great work of weird fiction. He's a really interesting guy, a great follow on Facebook because he talks a lot about movies and adapting novels to movies. He puts together a monthly viewing of Western movies, and he gets other authors and filmmakers to watch Westerns together, and then he talks about them. But The Totem is a super cool kind of folk horror novel. And at one time I owned a really big hardback version, and huge hardback books are kind of my least favorite books to own. If I can't get them any other way, I'll put up with a big hardback like this Investigators of Arkham Horror and that King Arthur book. But I prefer mass market size. And so I loved finding this version of The Totem with that great cover. And this is Pottersfield, Wyoming, a small western town like hundreds of others. Even the incidents that started that midsummer's night seemed routine. The dead hitchhiker, victim of a hit and run, the coroner's heart attack, the drunk dead in the culvert, his face destroyed. Slowly, the routine began to twist to unexplainable horror, and slowly, under the search rays of the two full moon, it walked. Now, this is a cool book. Another book I got off of a recommendation of one of my two close reading friends, and that is William Beckford's Vathic, the history of the Caliph, including the episodes of Vathic with original notes. Of course, this is from the Ballantine Adult Fantasy with an introduction by Lynn Carter, with a quote from H.P. Lovecraft. This fantastic volume potently reflects the haughty luxury, sly disillusion, bland cruelty, urbane treachery, and shadowy spectral horror of the Sarkin spirit. This is kind of a book from antiquity, I believe. I'm not quite sure. See, the author was born in 1760, so maybe not as old as I thought it was. but I've heard some cool things about this and I am very curious. And it was not very expensive, especially for one of the lesser known Ballantine adult fantasy books. In a recent episode on the Dungeon Dive I did on the Red Sonja board game, I talked about David C. Smith because David C. Smith wrote the Red Sonja novels. And he also wrote Auron, his own character, his own sword and sorcery character. And I was missing volume 5. So I finally found a copy of volume 5 that was in okay condition. This is one of the Zebra, I think. Yeah, this is the Zebra version. And I think this is the final volume of Auron. And this is Auron, the Ghost Army. So I've only read the first Auron book, but I'm curious about the rest. Now, this book I did not purchase, but I wanted to bring it into this discussion here because it's The Shadow People by Margaret St. Clair. So The Shadow People is probably the rarest book that I own. Maybe the rarest book mentioned in Appendix in fiction. It is almost impossible to find a version of this book or an edition of this book that looks nice, that is less than $100. This was about $40 and it can probably survive one read. It is very, very delicate. It's falling apart. Looks like a little rip on the cover, but I've had this for a while. I finally tracked down a cover, or I finally tracked down a copy, and the cover, of course, being done by the great Jeffrey Catherine Jones. Shadow People is a very bizarre novel. The invasion of the hallucinogenic people from underneath. They had existed from time immemorial, hidden in a space warp far beneath the surface of the earth. Until now, their only form of nourishment had been a strange hallucinogenic grain. Now they hungered for human flesh. The earth was to be their stockyards and mankind their meat. Based on that synopsis and the cover, you might think it is a work of sword and sorcery. Based on the fact that it is included in the Appendix N, you might think it is a work of sword and sorcery. But the novel actually takes place in the 70s in Berkeley, California. Believe it or not. Now, the reason I bring up this book as not part of this book haul is because I recently purchased The Sign of Labrus and The Dancers of Noyo, two other books by Margaret St. Clair, and these three books form a kind of thematic trilogy. So The Sign of Labrus, I absolutely fell in love with the back of this book. I think this is fantastic. This gives you a glimpse into what it was like during this time. When was this published? In 1963. Okay, so imagine 1963. Women are writing science fiction. Original, brilliant, dazzling. Women are closer to the primitive than man. They are conscious of its moon pools, the earth tides. They possess a buried memory of humankind's obscure and ancient past, which can emerge to uniquely color and flavor a novel. Such a woman is Margaret St. Clair, author of this novel. Such a novel is this, Sign of Labrus, the story of a doomed world of the future saved by recourse to ageless immemorial rights. Fresh, imaginative, inventive. Yes, women write science fiction. Can you believe it, guys? But I thought that back was just such a relic of its time, such a great kind of just a capture of the social time that this was written in. And I had to have this edition just for that back here. And then I also picked up Dancers of Noyo. And this says, like so many others before him, reluctant Sam McGregor was sent on a pilgrimage for the Grail vision by the dancers. Androids grown from the cells of one man with the powers of hypnotism and illusion. Androids who held the tribes of the Republic of California in thrall. But soon Sam began to doubt his own identity, for he experienced a close succession, extra lives in different corridors of time and space, and he could not know whom his search would destroy, the dancers or himself. So really interested in these. I picked up this Shadow Castles by Duncan McGreary. A buddy of mine on Instagram posted a book haul he got, and I thought that cover looked cool. And so I was like, okay, I want to take a chance on this. You know, I'm kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel, I think, in my discoveries of sword and sorcery. I own about 300 or 400 books in this genre, and I think I'm slowly getting to the point where I've already purchased all of the really good ones. But this looked interesting, and I thought the cover was cool, and I thought it sounded pretty neat. Prince Greylock, the last surviving heir to the throne of the High Plateau, is banished from his frozen mountain homeland of Godshome by his uncle, the Tyrant. Yeah, so that sounds pretty interesting. And then 2 other books. Also, here is the Cains World by David Mason and The Return of Caven by David Mason. And this here has a quote from Elsprog de Camp. The Prince of Dorada battles a good, solid, heroic fantasy. Okay, a good, solid, heroic fantasy. That is kind of a very tepid recommendation, I guess. Never before published here. Let's see. The Luck of the World. Caven was an adventurer, though born of royal blood and destined to be Prince of Dorada, but the trappings of royalty were not for him. He wanted only to sail his prize white ship, an alien creation, across the broad seas of the world. But the world was in upheaval, and his homeland, Dorada, soon to be no more, as the wild men of the steppes raided down toward the sea. So it kind of sounds like pretty typical sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy stuff. We'll have to see how this is. The last in the tradition of Conan, the blazing sequel to Cain's World. And here we have not a novella, but a novel version of a novel. So Colin Wilson, of course, the original writer of The Space Vampires. And The Space Vampires was turned into the movie Life Force by Toby Hooper, director of Poltergeist. In the blink of an eye, the terror begins. Life Force is a fantastic movie, and I will be honest, a lot of that has to do with Matilda May. Very kind of early film crush, definitely. Original title, The Space Vampires. I have a version of Space Vampires, but because I'm into collecting novellas now, I wanted this novel version of The Space Vampires with the Life Force font and image here. Will the Earth ever be the same? The derelict spaceship was vast and like the landscape of a deeply disturbing dream. Equally strange were the immobile bodies of the humanoid passengers discovered by Captain Carlson and his men. Later, when 3 of the aliens had been transported to Earth, the oddity became a nightmare. The beings were energy vampires whose seductive embraces were fatal, whose eroticism few humans could resist. Again, Matilda May. As their lust for a life force remained insatiable and sexual murders spread, Carlson fought to discover who they were and how to destroy them before their evil hungers contaminated all of mankind, and Carlson himself became the willing victim of the most beautiful and irresistible alien of them all, Matilda May. But yeah, so that's Life Force by Colin Wilson. But speaking of novelizations, this is one of the first novelizations I read as a kid. Again, I wasn't allowed to see rated R movies, but I could read the books for some reason. And this is, of course, by Alan Dean Foster. What's really cool is this book is in great condition. I couldn't believe the price I got this for, and it looks like it's actually signed by Alan Dean Foster. I had no idea. It wasn't advertised as being signed. I don't know if that's actually his signature, but hey, somebody signed it as Alan Dean Foster, so I can pretend that it is. And this is actually a first printing from 1979. I think I got this for like $20 or something. It looks like it has hardly even been read. Let's see. Somebody, oh yeah, the seller sent me a note. Thank you so much, Dan. We hope the very best for you and your loved ones. Have a magnificent life. How nice. Thank you. I will cherish this book. And speaking of Alan Dean Foster, I have never read the Flinks and Pip books. And I've been wanting to, and I found this bundle of the first 6 in pretty good condition for a pretty good price. I love this cover here. That font is so cool. It's so prog rock. But that is the Tarium Krang. Then book 2 here, I believe, is called Orphan Star. Book 3 is Blood Hype. Yeah, Blood Hype. That's a great title. And then we have book 4, The End of the Matter. We have book 5, For the Love of Mother Not. And finally, we have Flinks and Flux. throughout my whole life, I've had friends who really enjoyed these books. I've had people compare them. I've heard people compare them to the kind of fun science fiction adventure of something like The Stainless Steel Rat, of which I am a huge fan. I like Alan Dean Foster. I admire him. And so I said, okay, I need to finally read these books. So I'm looking forward to finally diving into these. Well, all right, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this vlog/book haul video, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.